All right, welcome back. Part 2 of episode 4 of At The Helm podcast. We're going to jump right into it. First segment, we already talked about, I teased it in the end of the last video with what we learned is trouble at the top with Bama and UGA. We've seen both of those teams in the SEC so far struggle, which are supposed to be the two top teams in college football in general, honestly. And we've seen both of them struggle. Georgia has struggled over their past 2 games. You could really say against Missouri more. Bama struggled against Texas, and then they struggled for a little bit against Arkansas after Bryce Young went down. But there's other things that I think Bama should be concerned about as well. So trouble at the top. And then first question is, what are UGA's biggest areas of struggle over the past couple of weeks? And I'll let you answer that first, Asa.
Well, I think for me, the biggest thing is winning the line of scrimmage on the offensive and defensive line. Maybe not so much in pass protection, but as a person who's been watching Georgia football for quite some time, when you go from Todd Gurley to Nick Chubb to Sony Michel to DeAndre Swift and then to Kenny McIntosh and Kendall Milton, you can tell that there is a serious, fall off. And that's not to say Kenny McIntosh and Kendall Milton are bad players, because I've seen them make great plays in games, not just this year, but in years prior, and they belong on a Georgia roster. But they don't have, Todd Gurley and Nick Chubb, Sony Michel. They don't have a guy that they can go, in a game like Missouri when they needed to run the ball. And Dejon Edwards did a phenomenal job of kind of taking that role. But can you do that if you need him 3 more times? Looking at how Georgia's played, there might be, a time where you need to do that 3 more times in a game. And can Dejon Edwards do that? I don't know. Probably not. So, and then defensive line too. Missouri ripped off, I think, like a 65-yard run from like a former walk-on. And I don't know when the last time Georgia's let up a run over 30, 40 yards in a long time. Like, for Missouri to have the success they did have without even putting the ball in the air is a little concerning. And I know Georgia, they didn't have Wyatt, my name is running. Jalen Carter, excuse me. Sorry. Let's go. Jalen Carter. I know they didn't have Jalen Carter. He's been hobbled with an ankle injury these last couple of weeks, but that's inexcusable to have a former walk-on do what he did. And just, it's a very frustrating win for a Georgia fan. And I wasn't really worried about how they performed against Kent State. But for a Missouri team taking you to the fourth quarter and their only wins are against Louisiana Tech and Abilene Christian, that's not good. But I will say this, and
not at all.
After my long tangent, and I'll let you talk just about Alabama. Kirby Smart was 5-10 coming into games down by double-digit points in his Georgia tenure, and now he's 6-10. I know the win wasn't pretty, but I was watching that game, even entering the second half, maybe even the end of the first half, kind of expecting Georgia to lose and for me to go to bed with a pit in my stomach on a Saturday night. So the fact that they won it's like a silver lining in a really, really dark storm.
Exactly. And I agree with that. And that's kind of the same thing I had about Clemson, is like, there's something to be said about a team that still figures out a way to win. If they can figure out a way to win, and that's really most of it, like I would say half of it most of the time, it doesn't really matter. You know what I'm saying? You'll still be put at the top because of the name of Georgia, because of the name of Clemson. You will still be considered one of those top teams because you are a team that figures out a way to win, even when it does get tough. And like, this is the thing that I think people kind of underestimate. Like, in order for you to be the top team, you don't have to dominate every team you play. You don't have to go out there and just absolutely destroy. You can dominate a majority of the teams you play. You can only dominate half the teams you play and still be a playoff team because of what your team looks like. So I still think Georgia is a playoff team. But like you said, if I'm going to answer the question, what are Georgia's biggest areas of struggle? O-line, I'm going to rank them because I think there's 3 that's the biggest to me. O-line is the first one. Second one is the DBs. I think those DBs are very young. They make a lot of mistakes. They're kind of inconsistent in how they play. We saw Lassiter get beat a few times. We saw, I'm forgetting his name. It's Chris
Malachi
something,
Starks.
the safety. We saw him get beat a few times, or it was just Chris Smith. Yeah, Malachi Starks and Chris Smith. There was a few times that we saw that they were just not in the right place. Like they were just out of place where they were supposed to be in terms of coverage in their zones and everything like that, because Georgia runs a ton of zone. And I think that's what Missouri really, first of all, I think that's what Kent State exposed, and Missouri used what they saw against Kent State to do better. And that's why I think that Kent State game is more important than people think, because no one could see a way to beat Georgia until Kent State kind of gave a blueprint. They exposed those zones and they blitzed, because Georgia's O-line just, to me, isn't as great as it was hyped up to be, which is part of the reason why the running game hasn't been as great either in Kenny McIntosh and Kendall Milton. So I think that I would have to, Georgia's O-line has to figure it out, because even past the run game, they were getting blitz in the pass, and I think that was affecting Stetson Bennett. He went 55% in that game. He threw 312 yards. That's great. No touchdowns, though, and he went 55%. So he was missing a lot of passes, high, low, and people were in his face, and it was just causing problems. I think that's part of the reason why he fumbled that ball, the second fumble they had in the first half. He was kind of thinking about, like, oh, who's going to be here when they were running that read option, and they dropped it because they're too busy trying to look around of who's going to fly off the edge free. So I would have to say, number one, O-line, number two, the DBs, and then number three, Georgia's receivers. I do not trust those receivers. Ladd McConkey, when you're talking about the actual wide receiver position, Ladd McConkey is their most consistent receiver, and he's not even their best receiving option. You know what I'm saying? And that's not a problem. But if your top three receiving options are two tight ends and a running back, and your O-line isn't great, that's going to force them to have to stay in and block. And now you have to rely on those receivers who haven't done much to show that they can just be the guys that win you a game with Stetson Bennett. You know what I'm saying? So Dominique Blaylock had a couple good plays, and I think that he could step up a lot and do something better. But overall, I would say those receivers just aren't great. When they found a way to Missouri found a way to take Brock Bowers out of the game, and we saw how much they were hurting at that position in terms of who was going to be catching the ball next. And it was mostly Darnell Washington.
I will say, I think those are definitely some valid points you brought up, especially with the defensive backs. Georgia, as an honest Georgia fan, Georgia has been the beneficiary of a historic run of, defensive line, edge players, and linebackers these last couple of years under Kirby Smart. And a great front seven can always put a little salt on a bad secondary and make it taste a little bit better, because you're not as challenged, exactly. Right? So I think this year with the, kind of fall off, and you don't have, Jordan Davis, you don't have Nakobe Dean, and you don't have Coit Walker, and these guys are NFL level guys. The young secondary that Georgia has is going to get exposed a little bit, but I do say I think there is a bright future in the secondary, though. I think Malachi Starks is a hell of a football player. I think all you need to know about him is that play against Oregon, that interception he got week 1. But they'll get there. And Stetson, I will say this about Stetson, because I do want to talk about Stetson Bennett a little bit. He's doing the
That was
same.
My next question.
He's doing the same. All right, well, he's doing the same Jekyll and Hyde thing he did when just not last year. He's just missing a little guy this much high. He's missing a little bit to the left, or he fumbles a snap when you're driving midway through down, and it's just like, oh, but then at the same time, it's like, he makes throws in the fourth quarter, and he puts up, 8 points, and he wins you the game. But I don't know. Carson Beck is a guy that Georgia would turn to as a second option. And he's shown some flashes in limited action he's got. And he's a tall quarterback, which I know a lot of Georgia fans will be happy to hear, dealing with someone who's around our height. So.
Exactly.
But Bennett, I think they'll figure it out. I think it's a little too early to write off this Georgia team, though. I still think they're very, very good. But I think we'll talk about it a little bit later. The SEC East is also very good, too. So.
Exactly. And that's why I had to do that in my What Did We Learn? It's because the SEC is just so much harder. And like Kirby came out and said it in the press conferences, an SEC schedule is not an easy schedule. Like this is not something that you can just fly through and do whatever with. And that was kind of what I think people got in their minds last year, is that a lot of those SEC teams just didn't look great. LSU looked bad, Auburn looked bad, and all that other. And those are usually the teams, or in Florida didn't look good. And those are usually the teams you see in that second tier of SEC after you look at Georgia and Bama. And those second tier of teams weren't that great. But now you can say those second tier of teams are a lot better. And you can include Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, A&M. Like, it's a big second tier. So I think that, yes, Georgia still has the rest of their schedule ahead of them. They control their destiny. Absolutely. Have we seen them struggle? Yes. Does that mean that they're done? Absolutely not. Not close. But I do want to, like, and that was my question, and you basically answered it, but I'm going to give my answer is that I think what I put here is Stetson turning back into the mailman. And that's not a good thing, because Stetson was called the mailman last year and the year before when he wasn't playing great. And that was, and to me, yes, that was his nickname of like, oh, like, he's the mailman. He delivers every time. But outside of Georgia, I think that name was more used as like a joke, like Stetson, the mailman Bennett. Like, there's no way Stetson is going to be the guy that wins you all these games. And I think that is just coming back to light now. He's not covered up as much by a world beater defense, and his receivers aren't that great, and his running game isn't helping him a ton in every single game. So Stetson's had to do a lot of passing yards, which is why he almost leads college football in passing yards. But at the same time, Stetson is not the guy who's going to win you a game while doing that, to me. He got a great drive at the end of that Missouri game. But I think Missouri shot themselves in the foot a couple of times on those last few possessions that they had. They just given the ball back, and then defensively started playing conservative to an extent, letting guys get open and playing off and stuff when you're only up by a little bit, which is crazy to me. But Stetson, is he turning back into the mailman? I won't say that yet. I won't say that he's turning back into the Stetson we saw that you argue whether or not he should be the starting quarterback, because I don't know if Carson Beck is the level. He hasn't shown me what JT Daniels showed me, where you could actually make it a conversation. You know what I'm saying? So right now, Stetson is not the mailman, but like he's getting close. Like he's eking back into being what Stetson is as a ceiling, which is a little bit of a glorified game manager.
I will say this, for a guy like Stetson Bennett to have a national championship in the back burner of his brain helps a lot. If Georgia doesn't win in January, this Stetson Bennett's brain is a lot more, his mind's racing a lot faster and his brain's a lot more fogged. He has, okay, I've done this before. I know, and I think that helps a lot for a quarterback and his confidence and kind of just his psyche in general. But, you know, we'll see. Georgia has a couple tune-up games coming up on the schedule before they really get into some serious action. So, you know, I think they got Auburn at home, and then after that they have...
It was Auburn, Vandy, and then Florida.
Yeah, all right, Auburn, and then even Florida, they might not even, you know, in 3 weeks, where is Florida going to be if they lose their next two games? So I think they'll figure it out.
Well, it's Auburn, Vandy a bye week, then Florida. But yeah, I think the biggest competition, and I told my dad about this earlier, and we might talk about this later during our game picks too, is Georgia. The biggest thing Georgia has to worry about right now to me is Tennessee. Because Georgia can go out and they can lose to Auburn and still make an SEC championship because Auburn's in the SEC West. Now, do I think they'll lose to Auburn? No. Do I think Auburn might put up a little bit more of a fight than Georgia would like? Yes. I think Auburn's offense is kind of slept on in terms of their quarterback and what they're able to do offensively. Defensively, not good at all. But offensively, I think they're a little bit better than what people give them credit for. So I could see them maybe challenging Georgia in the first half. But overall, I still see Georgia wiping that game and then the next one against Vanderbilt. I think the toughest game they'll play coming up in these next few weeks will be Florida. And then after that, of course, Tennessee is going to be the hardest one they play all season. Florida will just be tough because Anthony Richardson is all over the place. That's going to have to be something that they deal with in terms of what type of Anthony Richardson we're going to see that day.
Yeah.
So, I give Georgia. I think they still win out this schedule, but that Tennessee game is going to be very, very tough. And they don't really have leeway to lose to Tennessee, because if they lose that one game and then don't go to an SEC championship and Tennessee wins out and only loses an SEC championship, they'll get put in over Georgia, in my opinion.
I agree. It would scare me. That game would scare me a lot more. I don't know. I was going to say something, but I think the Tennessee game does kind of scare me, because the way they finished out Florida, and especially the end of that first half, was very impressive. And that was a sign of like, okay, this is a well-coached football team that can execute in, situations you need to in order to win a football game. So I don't know, man. I guess we're going to talk about Bama now.
Hooker, man. Yeah. That was my next thing, is with the second part of trouble at the top. Can Bama get by? Okay, we all saw, first of all, a little bit of like background. Bryce Young went down, shoulder sprain. He went down on a play, landed on it kind of awkward, was in the game for about 2-3 more plays, but most of them were runs. And then the first pass he tried to throw, you could tell his arm was just like, it didn't look right. Like the pass was on target, but like you could tell afterwards he was feeling his arm. He threw his helmet down, was screaming at people on the sideline, went into the tent. He was pissed off. So Jalen Milroe came out there, and he did a decent job as a quarterback. In terms of as a player to help us win the game, he went out there and he put us on his back for a couple plays, and that was the reason why that game didn't get as close as it maybe would have. So that's basically the background. Is Bryce Young's out, and it says Saban said a shoulder sprain. I don't know how true that is or how long Bryce Young will be out with a shoulder sprain. What I've seen from most sources is 2 weeks, maybe 1 week if they're lucky, depending on how the recovery goes and everything like that. But my question is, can Bama get by A&M and possibly the next few weeks after that if Bryce Young isn't there?
I think they can. I think Milroe, they're going to figure the offense out. That was a really tough situation for him to cut him into, even with that lead he had. And like you said, he put the team on his back. He had 2 great runs in the fourth quarter that, put the game away. And Alabama's going to do Alabama things no matter what numbers at quarterback. So I think they'll figure it out. And, A&M, I think we both can agree they're just not on the same level as Alabama. They even weren't last year. Can every team get, a fluky win every once in a while? Yeah, and their fluky win was last year. So I think Alabama will be just fine. And I don't think Nick Saban will rush Bryce Young, especially, that's more dependent on how Milroe does. But I think Bryce Young will probably be out for at least 2 games, maybe 3. I was kind of looking some stuff before. I mean, his injury depends how bad it really is. There is a side of me that says Saban, much like Belichick, is kind of sugarcoating what the injury might actually be, because
that's what I'm scared of.
You don't want to play your cards and be like, well, we don't have this guy for the next 7 games. So, it's like,
exactly.
I don't know. I'll let you talk more about it, because I think you got a lot more to say than I do.
I agree. I think it's being sugarcoated a little bit. And that's for 2 reasons. One, you don't want teams to know that you're without your best player. Like, you can't just go in there and be like, oh, yeah, we don't have our best guy. And now teams have a new way to prepare for you and an easier way to beat you. And they don't have to try to prepare for multiple different types of things. Because right now, the situation post A&M looks like teams are most likely going to be preparing for Milroe and Bryce Young, because they don't know exactly who's going to be in there. But I will say this. The other reason is because I think that a lot of times, and this is what they did with Tua a few years ago. Tua hurt his ankle, and they were like, oh, it's not that bad, all this other stuff. But then they had 24/7 hour watch on Tua. This man had an air cast. He traveled in separate private planes when he went to games. There was a personal trainer with him literally all times of the day. I wouldn't be surprised if that guy was bunking with him in his room. Like it didn't stop. And I think it's gonna be the same way for Bryce Young, because you say that 2 weeks, I don't give that 2 weeks, man. I don't give that 2 weeks because if Alabama gets by A&M and the next game they play is Tennessee and Milroe is our starting quarterback, we're in trouble. I do not trust our DBs to be able to stop Hendon Hooker enough that we can just run the ball and beat Tennessee. Because I think that's what I don't think. I know that's what Milroe's strength is, and I already know that's what Bill O'Brien is coaching for because Bill O'Brien's a terrible offensive coordinator. So I would say that, can they get by A&M this week? Yes, sure. Can they get by Tennessee the week after? I don't think so. I don't see that happening unless Bill O'Brien figures out a way to get Milroe more acclimated to throwing the ball. And I think the biggest problem is that Bill O'Brien's offensive play calling is terrible, man. It's either run the ball or we're throwing it over 15 yards. What happened to short throws? I think that's exactly what Milroe needs. It's kind of, and to me, what we should run is kind of the same package we had with Jalen Hurts in his first or second year or with Blake Sims. You're running a lot of short passes and then running the ball. You know what I'm saying? And then once those short passes and running the ball bring the defense up, then you can use those play actions. I don't know if Bill O'Brien is smart enough to make a game plan like that, which is what scares me because this game against A&M is going to be all rushing. A&M has no quarterbacks that are great either. They run the ball almost like it feels like 70, 75% of the time. And I think it's just going to be a game in the trenches of who can beat each other up first, honestly, and get tired first of running the ball. And then after that, if you can make a few throws, that's going to win the game. I still give Bama this A&M game, like I said. But after that, with Tennessee, I don't see Bama winning with Milroe. I just don't. That's going to have to be a quarterback battle.
I don't see Bama winning with Milroe, but I do see Bama winning with Jahmyr Gibbs. If Alabama did not have Jahmyr Gibbs, I think I'd press the panic button. But Jahmyr Gibbs is an animal, man. I mean, he's doing like Najee Harris level stuff and maybe even a little bit better. Like that guy's a different breed. And for him to flip the switch and pop that 75-yard run in the fourth quarter, he can just break a game. And when you know you have that in Bill O'Brien, I mean, I think they're going to change their offense to kind of be like a Cam Newton-esque read option offense. Like I really think they're going to fully buy into this Jalen Milroe experience. And yeah, I think they're going to be fine. I think Alabama's going to figure it out, and Bryce Young is going to get put right back in whenever that may be. But a little bit of me is kind of being a nihilist because I hate Alabama, and that part of me says they are just going to figure it out, and they're going to 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever. It's like, of course they're still undefeated, and Bryce Young, but
yep.
I know that's real life's a lot different than my head, so we'll see.
Yep. And then the second question I had for Bama is, well, basically the same thing. What should we expect with Jalen Milroe and offense with him behind center? Do you expect to see Bill O'Brien still trying to incorporate the passing they were doing with Bryce Young to an extent? Or do you, like you said, do you think it's just all going to be read option and Jahmyr Gibbs, Jalen Milroe?
I mean, I think Alabama's wide receiving core has shown that they can go that route and still air the ball out and throw the ball downfield 40 times a game. And I don't think you'd be wearing an Alabama uniform if you couldn't do that. But I don't know. Like you said, I think this next game, especially with A&M, is going to be fought in the trenches. And a rivalry game like that kind of seems like that's how they're won and lost. So I think they're probably going to lean more to what they know they have out of Milroe, and that's using his ability as a runner. Mm-hmm. So I could see for this week, especially kind of it's just such a blindside injury, and you weren't really prepared for it. Exactly. Probably going to stick more to the short passing game, RPO, read option, stuff like that.
And I agree. I think that was one of the things I was looking at is Bill O'Brien has never really run an RPO before, but does he get into that due to the type of quarterback we have? We ran a lot of RPO with Tua, and Tua wasn't even really a running quarterback. Now you add a running quarterback to the mix and a read option, that can be a really dangerous RPO. I hope Bill O'Brien can figure out a way to do that in 1 week and install that, because I feel like the athletes that Alabama has are good enough to do that quickly. But it just really all depends on Bill O'Brien. And like I said earlier, this is going to be a game in the trenches. It's going to be an almost all running the ball game. I wouldn't be surprised if the score ends up being like 21 to something. But the thing I like about this game is that A&M turned Alabama up in the offseason. Like they got all the bittering back and forth, and then Jimbo Fisher talking to Saban talking about Fisher. This is going to be a hype game. And that was something that I think was missing from Alabama last year going into A&M. They went into Arlington and they just kind of basically laid down. Like they felt like they had that game in the bag because A&M had lost 2 games before that they weren't supposed to. And then they lost because they went out there not trying for real, and they figured out a way to slow down Will Anderson. Well, now we know they know how to slow down Will Anderson. We now have Dallas Turner, which should help. And then on top of that, Alabama's not going to go in being all lazy because they want to beat A&M this year because of what happened in the offseason and what happened last year. So that's the thing that I'm kind of trusting, is that Alabama is going to be in this game a little bit more energized and hyped to start off, which will get them that kind of kick that they need to beat a team like A&M, running wise especially. I think that, like you said, Jahmyr Gibbs will have a big game. Jalen Milroe is going to have a big game rushing wise. And I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those fast receivers that we have, Kobe Prentice, Isaiah Bond, catching short passes and running. I'm going to see a lot of wide receiver screens. So I think that that's what the offense is going to look like, a lot of 5 yards and shorter, and then maybe a few deeper plays. We'll see. I think Alabama still pulls it off, and I'll give a score later on our game picks.
I like your take about the energy in the game. Sorry, my dog's barking. I like your take about the energy in the game because something that Alabama kind of showed as maybe a fault, and maybe they've corrected it since then, but in that Texas game, and Will Anderson especially, who did have a great game, but they were getting so many penalties because of unnecessary roughness or a face mask or a block in the back or, penalties that you get in those kind of games like you're talking about, right? So does it happen again for Alabama? Probably not, but definitely something to keep an eye on.
For sure. And then we can skip over the last question. Last question is which teams can capitalize on the uncertainty. I feel like we've touched on that a good bit. Tennessee, Kentucky, Ole Miss.
Everyone still kind of controls their own destiny at this point.
Exactly, yeah. Because these are all teams that are undefeated or only one loss and can definitely show that they can do something if things go the right way. So we're going to go into the second part of this, and a new game that I want to play and maybe even do in the future as well. It's Panic or Peace. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to name a team, a situation, a player, or anything in college football, and you get to tell me whether or not, and I'll tell you right after my opinion too, is whether or not it's time for fans to panic about that or it's okay for them to be at peace and let it play out. You know what I'm saying? And they could be at peace for 2 reasons. They could be at peace because it's done. Like, it doesn't matter anymore. Or they could be at peace because they think that it's okay, like, we'll figure it out. And the first one is, like we said, touching on it again, Alabama without Bryce going through the toughest part of their schedule. Is it time to panic if they get to Tennessee and Bryce doesn't look like he's going to be healthy?
I know we kind of just said that they could win, but if they don't get to Tennessee, or if they get to Tennessee and there's no Bryce Young, I don't know how you can be at peace going into that game. I really don't.
No, sir.
I mean, even if you're an Alabama diehard, you've got to be a little bit nervous. This guy's, would it be his second start of his career? It's like,
yes.
And Alabama's Alabama, and they're going to show up, and they're going to perform, and they're going to keep it a good game. It's going to be a good game. I can't wait to watch it. But, yeah, I don't know how you wouldn't be panicking if you don't have the best player in college football taking the snaps going into Neyland Stadium.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and say if Alabama loses, and I wish I had scheduled some buttons more on my soundboard, so maybe I could have a panic and peace button. That'd be fine. But I would say for panic, we can use this one, slap. I'm panicking. I'm panicking. Oh my God, I'm panicking. If we get to Tennessee and Bryce Young is still out, like I said, Hendon Hooker, I think, is going to have his way with our defense, with our defensive backfield, I should say. Our DBs have been up and down. Terrion Arnold has been solid. Kool-Aid has been up and down. A lot of penalties this season. And then our safeties, I do not trust our safeties at all. And our middle of the defense is just a weakness. And I really see that Tennessee can run the ball like Hendon Hooker with his legs and their running back. So if they're able to do that and just get a little bit of that running game going, I know our DBs are going to fall apart because they're going to be too busy staring inside to try to stop a run and letting guys run past them. So absolutely, I am panicking if Alabama gets through A&M. I'm not panicking for A&M. If Alabama gets through A&M into Tennessee, panic time. Panic time if Bryce Young is not in that game. Next one. UGA struggling the past 2 weeks against teams that you wouldn't really expect. Is it time to panic or is it time to be at peace because UGA really doesn't have super competition until really November? So is it time to be at peace for now, or should they start panicking on what's going to happen in the future?
I think it's time for UGA fans to be at peace. It's time to relax. This team has been so good in the last 19, 20 games. I think they have one loss in the last 19 games. We're not used to seeing them struggle because they haven't struggled in the last season and a half. They just haven't. So, yeah, they're going to have, you're used to it because you've been a fan. You're in the dynasty. You know weeks like this. You're like, oh, whatever, it happens, right? We're kind of – I'm not saying Georgia's, in the start of a dynasty, but I'm saying it's like Georgia fans aren't used to this sustained success. I'm kind of used to it I was used to it as a Patriot fan, so I'm familiar with weeks like these last 2 weeks. I think UGA will be fine. I don't think UGA needs to panic. I mentioned it earlier in this segment. They got some tune-up games coming up against Auburn and Vandy before they go to, have the world's largest outdoor cocktail party in Gainesville. So relax. It's all good.
Yep. And we'll make this our peace sound. But I think you can be at peace if you're a Georgia fan for now. I will say that over these past 2 weeks, you can see the areas of struggle that Georgia has had and the things that they need to fix. But like you said, they play Auburn and Vanderbilt. Those are two perfectly fine games where you can go out and figure out everything you need to and take your time. You know what I'm saying? Like I said, Auburn might challenge in the first half. I don't see that being truly a game throughout 4 quarters. And then the same thing with Vanderbilt. I don't see that being a game for even 2 quarters in Vanderbilt. So right now, yes, Georgia, stay at peace. Once it hits, if Georgia still sees signs of struggling against those 2 teams and it hits November and they get to that bye week and they go into the bye week and they look like they're not great, okay, then it'll be time to panic. But for right now, I'm at peace. I don't see it falling off now. I see Georgia still as a playoff team. So not last one, but next one is Kentucky. Is it time to panic on Kentucky having a chance in the SEC East? They lost to Ole Miss. They still have to play Tennessee. They still have to play Georgia. They had the win against Florida, so they got that out the way. But Tennessee and Georgia are still ahead in their schedule. So is it time for them to panic in terms of having a chance of maybe making it to the SEC championship if they beat a Tennessee and Georgia team? Or is it time to be at peace and be like, okay, maybe we can pump the brakes and see how far Kentucky can go?
I would say it's time to panic just because I think to win the SEC East, you either need to go undefeated or have 1 loss. And Kentucky already has the loss. So, and like you already said, the teams that they have to play are only going to get harder, not easier. So not to say Kentucky's a bad team panic-wise, but panic because you're just not on the level I think you need to be to win the SEC East.
And I'm going to have to agree. That's a panic right there. Kentucky is not – they're not built to be able to beat a team like Tennessee, in my opinion. Offensively, they're solid, and Will Levis is a good quarterback. but they're still a team that relies mostly on defense, and then they kind of slow play on offense. If they got a faster start in that Ole Miss game, I think they might have won that game, but they didn't. They took a long time to really get going offensively, and then after that, it was their defense was doing solid, but not good enough to slow down a team like Ole Miss. So in my opinion, it is time to panic if you're Kentucky. They did lose to a team in the SEC West, so that doesn't affect their SEC East record in terms of making a championship. But like we said, the two hardest teams they play next, Tennessee and Georgia, are in the SEC East. So panic time. Kentucky's really done, in my opinion. And they do this almost every year. It seems like they challenge, and it's like, oh no, look at Kentucky. They might do something this year. And then they lose 2 or 3 games that they maybe weren't supposed to, or 2 or 3 games that they were supposed to. So it reminds me of Mark Richt, Georgia. You know what I'm saying? They can lose 2 games and they'll be okay with it because they're Kentucky. You know what I'm saying? They're meant to be a basketball school. So in terms of panic, in terms of they're not making an SEC championship, but at peace because we already knew this is what Kentucky was. So this is what they do every year since the past 4 or 5 years since they got Stoops as their head coach. So right now, panic. Next one. I'm going to skip over Dylan Gabriel in Oklahoma. It's panic time for them. They're done, so we don't have to talk about that one. Next one, Jimbo Fisher with A&M. And I think this is probably the most interesting one. You could go 2 routes, and I'll give you both of them. Jimbo Fisher, in terms of being the head coach, in terms of him being on the hot seat, is it time for them to panic? Because they keep losing games they're not supposed to. They lost 2 last year. They lost 2 this year already. And they might lose even more. They might end up this season with 4 losses. Is it time to panic on Jimbo Fisher in terms of that? And then the other thing you can ask is it time to panic in terms of – so let me word it this way. Is it time to panic or be at peace in terms of this season? And then is it time to panic or be at peace in terms of Jimbo Fisher being the head coach for the future of Texas A&M?
I think it's time to panic for both, honestly. You're at the point where you kind of know what you're going to get from Jimbo Fisher, and unless you have a generational quarterback, you're not going to win a national championship, especially when you are forced by law to play Alabama once a year every year. So
you have no choice.
You have no choice. And, I mean, if Jimbo Fisher was at a school in the Pac-12 or even the ACC and that had a good group of donors and, maybe – kind of like Texas A&M was really hungry, maybe like a North Carolina State, I think he could do really well because you wouldn't have to play such elite competition, and just buying players would work way better than it would playing in the SEC West, which is either 1A or 1B for hardest division in college football. So yeah, sell Jimbo Fisher, panic button all day long.
Okay, so I'm gonna say it's a little bit of both. The first part, panic. This season's done. You lost 2 games, and one of them was to App State, and the other one was to Mississippi State. You've now lost to 2 unranked opponents. This season is so beyond done that it's ridiculous. And the main reason is, 1, that quarterback is terrible. They do not have a real quarterback over there at Texas A&M. They had Haynes King, who was their quarterback last year, who wasn't doing great, and then they went and got Max Johnson from the transfer portal with LSU, and he's not great either. And he's been their starter for the past 2 weeks, and he was good enough to get them by Arkansas because Arkansas's defense is atrocious, and all you have to do is run against them. But past that, I don't see that quarterback getting them past anything else or that running game because everyone knows what they're going to do. They're going to run the ball. And this is what happened against them with Mississippi State. They got beat 42-24. That quarterback, Will Rogers for Mississippi State, went out there and put up numbers and made them look silly. Will Rogers was 31 for 45, 329 yards, and 3 touchdowns. If you don't think another quarterback in the SEC can do that, you're mistaken. So I think the rest of this season, like I said, panic. But in terms of Jimbo Fisher's future, you can be at peace. I think you can be at peace a little bit. And that's mostly just because they got that top recruiting class. Whether they paid for it or not, or how they got it with NIL deals, money, all this other stuff, they still got one of the top recruiting classes. I think it was top 3 last year. So I would still have to say, well, actually, they did get the top recruiting class of 2022. Actually, I forgot. So I would have to say that, yes, you can be at peace for Jimbo Fisher's future. If they get into next year and those guys don't seem like they're developing that they recruited, it will be panic time. Absolutely then. But as of right now, I give Jimbo 2 more years before it's time to be like, okay, this guy's on the hot seat. Maybe 1.5, honestly. So right now, in terms of Jimbo's future at A&M, peace. This season, panic. You're done. And the last one we have here is Florida. Is it time to panic for Florida? And that's mostly because they've already lost 2 games already, too. They lost to Tennessee, and then they lost to Kentucky. So, which are 2 good teams, but they're both teams that are on their side of the division. So in terms of making an SEC championship, they're really done. But is it time to panic or be at peace with Anthony Richardson? We've seen him be up and down all season, played a decent game against Utah, came out the following 2 weeks and looked terrible against South Florida and I can't even remember who. He looked pretty good against Tennessee when you watch that game. They lost that game, but I think that was just more of how good Tennessee was versus Florida messing up, honestly. So I'm kind of confused. Is it time to panic or is it time to be at peace with Anthony Richardson?
Anthony Richardson, I think it's time to panic. I don't trust someone who's this inconsistent still. Maybe just for this season though. If you look at the program as a whole, I think it's time. I think Florida fans can be at peace. You knew you weren't going to contend this year. You were maybe going to get a good season would have been 8 or 9 wins. A great season would have been 8 or 9 wins with a first year head coach. But I really like Billy Napier. I think he builds good programs. I think he's going to have a good culture in Florida. Might be the same issue with teams you see in the SEC West. Might be playing second fiddle to Georgia probably most of your tenure. But if you're good enough, you'll every once in a while you build a team that can beat Georgia and go to the SEC championship. And I think Billy Napier can do that for you. So I'd be at peace if I was a Georgia fan, And if Anthony Richardson isn't the guy, it's Billy Napier's first season.
Exactly. And I agree. Time to panic for Anthony Richardson. I won't say he's completely done. He might be Florida's starting quarterback next year. He's shown flashes. And he's still only, I think, in his second year. Yeah, he's a sophomore. Last year he was a freshman, and everyone was calling for his name and hyping him up. And I think he got a little bit too much. Well, not I think. We know he got too much hype. He was just didn't end up being the guy that everyone thought he was, of clearly better than Emory Jones. We can see why now Emory Jones was playing over Anthony Richardson at the time. And Anthony Richardson so far this season, 55 completion percentage, but he's thrown 4 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. So to me, in terms of Anthony Richardson, it's time to panic. I don't see him being the quarterback that gets Florida a win against Georgia. I don't see him being the quarterback that gets Florida to an SEC championship. But like you said, with Billy Napier in the future, they can build a program that's pretty solid. And if Anthony Richardson isn't a part of that, I can see them going pretty far and maybe even challenging Georgia every 2-3 years, like you said. So we'll see what they can do. But as of right now, Anthony Richardson, panic, and 55 completion percentage and then 6 interceptions. There's not much else to say about that. So if you want to add anything else, that's all I have for this part of the show, Panic or Peace. And I think that was a pretty good segment. I liked it. Yeah.
Yeah, good, man.
Awesome sauce. So we'll be right back. We're going to do our top 6 teams in our rankings, and then we're going to do some week 6 game picks. We have some pretty solid games coming up, so we'll be right back, and we'll see you on the next segment of episode 4 at the Helm.